walk or anything. Okay, so the record button has been hit, so everyone knows this is being recorded for longevity. You're welcome to turn on your cameras if you want to, but you don't have to. You are at Accessible Social Media at the Nerd Summit, and I really want to thank the Nerd Summit for having me because I love to talk about accessibility. As far as questions go, I prefer questions at the end because I'm hard of hearing, so I'll put on my headphones for that. So if you put them in the chat, just put a Q in front of them. That way, when I look at the chat at the end, I can parse through them. And then I think that's it for housekeeping. I do have a copy of the slide deck to share, and let me put that in the chat. I don't have that on my clipboard, so let me get that on there and I'll post it in chat. That way you can follow along because I do talk about some stuff very generally, but there's links to get more information for resources. Okay, so I will start. My name is Amy June. I use the pronouns she and her. My name is Title Camel Case, all one word, capital A, capital J. I am the QA engineer and accessibility auditor at Canopy Studios, but my main job is to work in the community as an open source ambassador. So I'm Canopy's corporate citizenship. They pay me to give back to the community, so that's nice. In the community, I help organize Ally Talks, A11YTLKS, that's Accessibility Talks, where we get together once a month and we talk about all things digital accessibility. I help the core mentor team with Drupal contributions at the local and regional and DrupalCon level. And I'm a member of the community working group community health team. So I do a lot in Drupal. But that doesn't really answer the question of like, who am I to speak about accessibility? In a previous lifetime, I was a hospice nurse. Well, I still am a hospice nurse. So I really understand the barriers that some folks have when trying to access digital assets across the web. So when I got into tech a few years ago and I learned that folks could make accessible websites or accessible media or anything like that, and they didn't, it was sort of this, like, just this moment where I decided that was my niche in Drupal, was the accessibility. Before I began, I'm sitting here in Northern California, so I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Ohlone lands. And this really is just a demonstration of a commitment to begin the process of hopefully dismantling the legacies of colonialism. Like I said, I work with Canopy Studios. They bring me here today. We are an open source website strategy, design, and support agency. We specialize in data-driven solutions, and we build and support websites for companies that like to make a positive impact. And we're hiring. We're hiring all kinds of Drupal positions. We're hiring project managers. We're hiring designers. So if you know anyone or you are interested in finding out about Canopy, just feel free to DM me. I'm always open about how I feel about working for them. So let's get into why we're here, right? Because we're here for a reason. I'm going to talk about what is social media, kind of in a broad sense. I'm going to go over some terms and definitions, and I'm not going to go over them too in depth, but I am going to kind of skirt around some acronyms. I'm going to talk about designing for accessibility. I'm going to talk about what meaningful content is. We'll look at different types of images, and then we'll go beyond alt text and kind of talk about what's next in accessibility as well. So what is social media? If you were at the keynote just now, he talked quite extensively about social media. It's sort of just this catch-all word for any sort of application that helps us network, communicate, collaborate, and really content share. And of course, there's all different types of social media. There's not just those like Facebook and Twitter that we think about. And Instagram, newsletters can be social media, blogging, wikis, curation sites like Pinterest or Reddit, forums and videos, video platforms like YouTube and Vimeo. Those are social media. And then there's some business cases around social media. Social media is often used to market products and the brands around them, but they're also used to connect customers. They're used to crowdsource and I think maybe primarily to allocate new business. You have CRMs, and that's customer relationship marketing. You have analytics, you have networking, and then I mentioned crowdsourcing, and some people might not know, what exactly I mean by that. But crowdsourcing is really outsourcing your work to a larger undefined crowd of people. In this case, it's your followers. So it's like polls or like insights into your products and things like that. So terms and definitions, like I said, I'm not going to go too in depth, but I want to cover enough for people who are new to accessibility. So there's standards and guidelines. There's the ADA, which stands for the Americans with Disability Act. And this really prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people who have and live with disabilities have those same opportunities as everyone else to participate in things like employment or going to the library, being able to go to the store and purchase goods, and participate in local and state governments as well. 508, we often hear that our sites have to be 508 compliant. What that section is it requires agencies, federal agencies specifically, to procure, maintain, use information and technology around communications and make sure that it's accessible to people who live with disabilities. And it is federal, but this is regardless of whether or not people work for the federal government. Canada, there's an Accessible Canada Act, which is B81C. It ensures a barrier-free Canada to Parliament. And W3C, and this is a mouthful for me, and I always like kind of flub it up, but it's the World Wide Web Consortium. And that's an international community that develops guidelines and makes sure that our web grows in a way that's helpful for everybody. So another acronym we might see is WCAG, W-C-A-G, and I've heard it pronounced different ways. I just say WCAG. You might hear WCAG. But what this is they really have a goal to provide a single shared guideline for everyone. And I want to mention that these are success criteria for an accessible experience. And these guidelines are primarily for really anybody who wants a defined web standard. Our content creators, our developers, our back-end developers, the people who make the accessibility tools. It's really that set of guidelines that everyone goes with. And then those guidelines are broken down into different success levels. We've got A, AA, and AAA. And each A in the level indicates an additional criteria to follow. So A is your very minimal compliance. If your website doesn't meet this level, it means that it's really hard for people to use. For people with disabilities to use. And then AA, this is sort of the level that everyone strives for. It indicates sort of that acceptable criteria, which means your website is usable and understandable for the majority of people. And then there's that AAA, AAA. This is a really tough level to hit. It's that optimal compliance, which means that your website is accessible to the maximum number of users. And this is an important part of this, with or without disability. So it comes down to usability when we meet this criteria. Sometimes you'll hear POUR, which is an acronym for the high-level principles around accessibility. We have perceivable, which means that the user can identify content by their senses. Operable means that people can use the controls, the navigation, the interactive elements successfully. And there's understandable, that's your users are able to comprehend what is going on. They can use your interface and it's consistent enough to remember how to use it from page to page. And robust, that really means that no matter what technology people want to use, they're able to use it, not only on your website, but for digital assets as well, like multimedia and documents. And then I want to define assistive technology for folks because some people just think of screen readers and assistive technology goes way beyond the screen readers. It's any device, and I'm just going to read this for ADA purposes. It's any device, software, or equipment that helps people work around challenges that that uh, that they may have navigating information. It can mean speech input devices, pointers, keyboards, a mobile phone, for instance, can be considered an assistive technology. So now that we've kind of like got some of those definitions out of the way, let's talk about different ways we can accommodate accessibility. And the first one is at the design level. But why do we design for accessibility? Well, it's the law, and that's unfortunately a lot of people's reason for designing for accessibility. But it really comes down to having a wider consumer base for your products and services. When you don't have an accessible product, that means you exclude people from being able to use it. Accessibility is really essential for not only organizations and developers, but everyone in general that want to create high quality websites and tools. And according to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, 26% of Americans or people who live in the United States, live with a disability. And that's roughly 1 in 4 if you want to break down those numbers even further. And we have to remember as we get older, we become more disabled with time. I am extremely hard of hearing. That's happened to me over time. It's not a disability I was born with. Our eyesight, we wear glasses. Think about noisy workrooms. Especially now that we're at home and we have kids running around. That could be a situational disability. The user on the plane that forgot their headphones, people recovering from surgery or LASIK. And we have to remember too, you can't tell someone has a disability by looking at them. There could be fatigue or dizziness or cognitive dysfunctions, brain injuries, learning differences, mental health disorders. These are all things that we need to accommodate when we think about the way we deliver our media. It goes well beyond that vision and sight. And so why do we want accessible content for social media? In October 2017, WebAIM conducted a survey of screen readers. These are people who use screen readers to get their information. Of almost 1,800 people that they screened using screen readers, 88% of them use screen readers on their phone, mobile handheld device, or tablet. And of those 88%, only 54% found social media somewhat accessible. So you're talking about millions of people not being able to access your content on their mobile phone. And honestly, that's how a lot of us get most of our information these days. Another reason to have accessible social media is that colleges are now facing investigations due to the use of their social media. In 2019, almost 200 colleges faced federal civil rights investigations. And among the newer aspects of these kinds of complaints is whether or not the college social media communication meets accessibility standards. I always like to include inspirational quotes in my talk. Some people do Star Trek gifs and things like that, but I like the quotes. Temple Grandin, she's an American professor of American science at Colorado State University, a consultant to the livestock industry, but she's one of the most vocal autism spokesperson. And I love this quote. She says, "I'm different, not less, because differences are not quantifiable." So as we talk about media, we also want to talk about the content that we're delivering around the media. So the slide says meaningful content. What do I mean by meaningful content? We have to think about who our readers are. Of course, we have target audiences, but really our content is for everybody and it should be inclusive. So along with this accessible media, I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive media as well. Meaningful content means that you can't make assumptions. assumptions create huge barriers, you know, much like inaccessibility. We can't assume a person's political stance. We can't assume their socioeconomic class. We shouldn't assume anyone's abilities. But we also have to be sure that we represent everyone as well. I was doing a little bit of research before this talk, and I found the Gina Davis Institute website, but it was under some sort of other umbrella, and I can't remember what it is now. But it was the Gina Davis Institute of Gender and Media. And the statistic I sort of hit home was characters with disability make up only 2.2% of characters in 2019 ads, but our general population is 19% globally. So in pictures of our content in media, we only had 2.2% of people displaying with disabilities, but 19% of our global audience live with disabilities. That's kind of a shocking number. Other common assumptions people make around are around gender, you know, sexuality and pronouns. Those are all very different things, you know, so just be aware of the language that you use. Brands should create content that speaks to their audiences as a whole. Back to that Gina Davis Institute of Gender Studies, it was said that young, white, straight, able-bodied cis men in imagery is very common. So also look at that imagery around that, you know, consider the pictures and what gender roles people are portraying. Who is pictured doing the dishes or watching the children, you know, or even something as simple as, is romance heterosexual all the time in your imagery? And so here's some numbers. In ads, 7% of characters 60 plus, only 7% of characters 60 plus were representative, where globally that number is 19%. 7.2% of people are shown with large body types, but that number is 39% in the wild. And then LGBTQ, they're basically non-existent in our content media. Only 1.8% are represented on the screen, but it's 10% global. So those are just some numbers to think about when you have that imagery on your site and in your media. And one last thing about inclusive social media is, before posting any image to social media, make sure that it's not promoting racist, sexist, ageist, or homophobic or other stereotypes. So I just wanted to call out digital blackface. This refers to non-Black folks claiming Black identities online, or to non-Black folks using Black people in their GIFs or memes to convey your own thoughts and feelings, you know. So just as companies wouldn't tolerate a white person taking the stage dressed in blackface, we need to make sure we have that same sort of no tolerance in online spaces as well. Because it comes down to white people using Black people's GIFs. It's really dangerous because they perpetuate Black stereotypes, you know, like sassiness or anger and excitement. And it turns Black emotions into comedy at the pleasure of white people. So the problem lies that Black individuals have been and still are sort of exploited in the media for humor. Okay, so let's talk about images in our media, you know, kind of shift back into that accessibility topic. Why do we love images? Well, images enhance our content, especially for people who live with cognitive or learning disabilities. We include images and media that support and add to our information and concepts. But for folks who live with low vision, they use images as cues to orient themselves on the page. Images can improve usability by making interactive elements easy to recognize and find. And then media, including social media that uses images, it's great for conversions. You know, having images on posts have been documented to having a higher click-through rate, or ROI, which is return on your investment. And then there's there's many different types of image types, and I have them listed here, but I'm not going to go through them because I'm going to go through them individually here in a second. But first I'm going to pause because I'm part of the diversity the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Slack channel, and Preston relayed a Twitter post in there about some things that he's been experiencing as an Asian American. So I want to make sure that, well, for me, I think our communities should stand against racism, you know, because hate against Asian American Pacific Islander communities have really risen during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just want to invite folks to check out that hashtag and see some stories of some of our fellow people, you know, and ask people to be a little bit more humane these days. Okay, so they're simple images. These are images that just convey simple information. And then these images should be described with alternative text. Sometimes we'll see it written as alt text. And alt text is a short, sweet description of the content of the image. And it's typically invisible to people who don't need it, but exposed to people who are using assistive technologies like screen readers or Braille output devices. The description of these simple images should convey the content and functionality of the image as concisely as possible to provide access to the content of the image without adding a ton of details, because they're simple images. Now there's complex images, and these can be a number of different things. They can be graphs, they can be charts, they can be diagrams, and they really contain too much information to be described effectively using that alt text. Instead, these images would be described using, you know, a long description. And a long description is a more detailed description that provides equivalent access to that information on the image. You know, you really have to ask yourself, given the current context, what information is this image intended to communicate? And this is especially valuable if there's no context around it. So if people are missing content because they can't see the image, that's when you really need to describe it. And that long description can include like structure necessary to communicate the content of the image, you know, like headings or data tables or something like that. Now, decorative images. I have my own opinion about decorative images. So first I'm going to give the general opinion about decorative images is that they're purely decorative and they're not informative. They don't convey information, you know, and with saying that they don't convey information, there's several ways to tell a screen reader to ignore the image. You can say that they're decorative. You can, you know, write null or just the two quotes in the field for that. And there's a number of different things that define what an image as decorative is. You know, you can have borders or spacers or corners. But here's my opinion on decorative images. If that decorative image, not the one I'm showing necessarily because it's sort of a geographic print, but if you have a decorative image on your page that conveys emotion, or you want to inflict emotion on people, you're doing some people who can't see that image a disservice. So if you have that image that evokes emotion, please describe that, because that's really important to the context of what you're trying to portray. There's images of text. This is basically readable text that's presented within an image. If the image is not a logo, we really want to try to avoid text in images though. But if we do have text and image, we want to make sure that that alternative text we provide contains the same words that are in the image, and then anything supporting that as well. Because let's break it down and think about why we don't want to use images of text. Using actual text is much more flexible than images, because if you zoom in, you know, text can be resized without losing clarity. Folks who have text, you know, if it's written in text, your background and your text colors can be modified to suit anybody's reading preferences. Images really get distorted when they're zoomed in and zoomed out. And then, like I said, in those situations where images of text can't be avoided, you know, just make sure that the alternative text is the same as the image. Groups of images, how should I put this? If multiple images, like the star rating on the phone, it conveys a single piece of information, the text alternative for one image should convey the information for the entire image. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more because I know the first time I heard that I was a little confused. So we have this group of 5 images, and I'm going to go off of the picture just a little bit. The combined rating shows a product rating, you know, one thing. Say there are 5 stars, 3 are filled in, 1 is half filled in, and the other one is empty. The text for the first image would say rating 3 out of 5 stars. And then all of the other images would have a null tag. So I'll say it again. The text alternative for one image should convey the entire information for the entire group. There's image maps. This is the last one I'm going to talk about. They contain multiple clickable areas. They can be park maps, like here in the picture. This is a park map of the bay between San Francisco and Marin. The text alternative for an image that contains multiple clickable areas should provide overall context for the whole set of links. And then each individual clickable area should have alternate text that describes the purpose and destination of the link. So you've got the overall text and then you've got the individual text, especially for those links, because you want to make sure that people know where they're going when they click on that image. And context is important. Be accurate and equivalent in presenting the same content and function of the image. You want to be succinct. You know, typically no more than a few words are necessary, though rarely a short sentence or two may be appropriate. This is something I see a lot when I do audits. Don't use image of or graphic of to describe the image. It's usually really apparent to the person using assistive technology that they're looking at an image. And a screen reader will announce it anyway. So a screen reader will announce image of a red barn, but if you put image of a red barn or picture of a red barn, that screen reader is going to say image of picture of a red barn. So it's really redundant. And then simply put, and I say this a couple of times, if you can turn off your images in your browser, will your user still be able to get all that information? So, you know, really think about the context of your picture and the information it provides. Because if people can't see that and there's no alt text, what information are they losing out in your media? So now let's go beyond the alt text and talk more about different things of social media. 2.2 billion people around the world live with some sort of vision impairment, color blindness, tunnel vision, low or no vision. So we want to be very mindful of the use of color in our media. We want to make sure that we have appropriate color contrasts. You know, I know, you know, a lot of like placeholder text will be gray on gray. Well, let's not do that. Let's do black on gray. Let's do, you know, bold white print on dark blue. Make sure that there's enough contrast between your elements. Visualize links, you know, add an underline or a hover animation to convey when text is clickable, you know, that it's an action item. And use symbols, you know, in graphs or in infographics, use symbols or patterns as an alternative or an addition to color, you know, add clarifying labels. And then we have to be aware that color can mean different things in different languages. And I just want to describe some of these pictures up here. You know, we have a map of the United States, and we have a color code at the beginning, but which is fine, but when it translates down into the map, if I had some color contrast issues or some low vision, I wouldn't be able to tell if Oregon and Idaho had 2 different colors. Without any sort of like textual information around that, this graphic is lost on me. And then above that graphic, you can see like some good color contrast versus some bad color contrast. There's all different kinds of tools that you can use. So just be aware that people who have that low vision or blurry vision won't be able to distinguish things if they're too close together. So videos, I mentioned that videos are a source of social media. We absolutely need to make sure that people who don't have access to hear have access to the information. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways that you can add textual information. Subtitles, there are lines of text that are transcriptions or translations of the speech or on the screen. Closed captions are similar, but they can include like oral information, like, if there's laughter or dog howling, if that's important to the scene. And both captions and subtitles are useful for that text alternative to sound. Captions can be closed or opened. Typically, we hear a lot about closed captions. Open captions are always in view and cannot be turned off, whereas closed captions can be turned on and off by the viewer. And captioning has really good universal design benefits for those who, for people beyond hearing loss. They help people who may have left their headphones behind. They help people whose English isn't their first or whatever language it's in isn't their first language. And then there's transcriptions. Video transcriptions is that process of translating the video audio into text. And this is often done with automatic speech recognition software. I told you I'm hard of hearing, and I can't always process audio information. So I rely on transcripts to go back and to the parts of conversations I've missed, especially now that we've gone virtual and everything's in Zoom. And I prefer transcripts. And the reason is you have the ability to scroll up and down in the chat, whereas captions fall off generally after 2 lines. And there's all different sorts of compliance level when it comes to transcripts. But if you need to sell it to someone, once you've turned that sound into text, you now have excellent SEO value because you now have text for sites to crawl, for your search engines to crawl. So not only is, captions and transcripts and subtitles valuable for your hearing impaired folks, but it's also really adds to your SEO. And then we have to talk about how we deliver our video, on our apps on our phones. We have to consider, the options if they're fully accessible. So if you're selecting, I want to go through some of the questions you might ask when you're selecting a video service. Does the media support closed captions? Does the media player support audio description in a way that people can toggle on and off the text? Can the media's buttons and controls be operated without the mouse, with the keyboard? Are the media's buttons and controls labeled? So let's say someone who is blind, and they're using a screen reader, can they figure out the controls? And then is the media player fully functioning, including all of its accessibility features across platforms and in all major browsers? Not everyone uses Chrome and not everyone uses Safari or Firefox. So think about, who's using what. Emoticons. Everyone seems to love emoticons and emojis, but who loves them more? Screen readers. They love emoticons so much that they read absolutely every single one of them. Think about it. I have a graphic on my slide that shows every word is separated by an emoji. So think about a person viewing or listening to this content in a screen reader. They're hearing one word and then an emoji, one word and then an emoji. This can be really cumbersome. And those people might not even stay on your social media post because it's just too hard. And you got to think about the emojis you put in subject lines of your newsletters, in our email signatures, and in our handles. So if you like to use them, that's fine, but it might be considered best practices to save emoticons and hashtags at the end of your content. Hashtags. Use capital letters to break up the words in your hashtag. This is called title camel case. And this just makes it really easier for people with assistive technology. And it comes down to readability too. Remember that when we do searches like on Twitter, Twitter doesn't distinguish between cases and search. So, you can have Black Lives Matter, all lowercase, and then Black Lives Matter, with the B, the L, and the M title case, it's going to come up with the same results. But if you're someone who might have, cognitive disability, having those capital letters really makes that word easier to parse. And not only, does it help, our friends with cognitive impairments, it helps people who are in a hurry and just kind of reading your media, people with low literacy, people who are stressed out, because you don't always get all the information when you have something going on or when you're multitasking. And then people, that English might not be their first language, which leads me into this hashtag that was used a few years back. It's now Thatcher is dead, but on the internet, people were thinking that Cher was dead because without those capital letters, it really was confusing for folks. And there's lots of words and series of words that people can cipher as differently, and it could be offensive, so be very mindful of that when and I know it takes a couple of extra keystrokes, but it's really worth that. Newsletters, newsletters are a form of social media. They get our information out, so think about structure, just like you think about your web page, think about your heading order. Make sure that your newsletters are predictable and consistent from newsletter to newsletter. People want to be able to quickly get in there and get the information and get out. If your newsletter is different every single time, with where things are spaced and like formatting, people aren't going to go very far. Think about how you design your newsletter, think about the white space around everything, think about font size, please make your links distinguishable, if they aren't distinguishable, people might not know that they're links, especially if you just use like color to distinguish, make sure you underline it or bold it or put it in a different font. Readability, make sure your newsletters are readable. In the United States, it's said that most people, or the average is the 9th grade reading level. Of course, you have those target audiences, say your university, but really, people read at that 9th grade reading level. Use plain language, avoid jargon and buzzwords. You can break up your content in easily digestible chunks with numbered lists and bullets. And then imagery, provide those captions and subtitles, even in your newsletters, because people who navigate the web also navigate your digital assets. So all of those same things that you would do on a web page, you should do in your media. And then other gotchas, acronyms and abbreviations, this comes back to that hashtag and, the clarity. Acronyms and abbreviations can really muddle clarity, so many screen readers don't recognize them, like I said before, and they're read as like one word. For unusual abbreviations and acronyms, supply sort of that key with a meaning, the first time you mention an acronym, supply what that meaning is, and then you can use the abbreviation there on out without the key. Sometimes using periods between letters in an acronym can really help screen readers parse the acronym. When writing alt tags with acronyms, add spaces between it, like B space, L space, M space. And let's look at this BLM thing. Without an acronym or without a key, some people might not know what you mean. Black Lives or BLM can mean Black Lives Matter, but my granddad had no idea, and he kept wondering what the Bureau of Land Management was in the news so much, so really think about defining what your acronyms are. Numeronyms, the same time, they are number-based words. One example where the letter is like the first and the last are there, but the letters in between are omitted with the number representing the letters that were taken out. So like accessibility, sometimes you'll see A11Y because between the A and the Y in accessibility, there's 11 letters. And often in web, we also see I18N, which is internationalization. And one of the reasons why 118N was broken up like that is because in our coding world, spelling isn't always universal. So we had different spellings of internationalization. And so in code, it made it easier to just have that 118N acronym. So I have a few minutes left. I want to talk about what's next? Like, what can you do now that you're sort of equipped with information? There's an easy way to increase the accessibility of your media. And lots of social media applications provide options to add alt text and captions, but unfortunately, they're not enabled by default. So you kind of have to dig into them and go and turn them on. But once they're turned on, they usually stay on. You know, a search on the internet can usually yield good results for articles. And most of the time, like I said, the apps have accessibility settings. So I have an image up here for Twitter. You click edit photo and it'll pop up this where you can either crop it on one side or you can add an alt text and you can add a description of whatever your image is there. And I want to point out something that's very interesting about Twitter is you only have what 280 characters in your tweet, but you have 1,000 characters in your alt text. So you can be creative with what you put and how you describe your images. Our marketers and our content creators are active participants in our media. So in many cases, they're in our websites and in our media way more than the coders are. So if coders and designers are trained for accessibility, so should our marketers and so should our content authors. You know, it's really an investment in the company. And there's tons of options as far as that goes too. Like we can add WYSIWYG with styles that people are encouraged to use that are accessible from the start. We can use quick tips and reminders and restrict what people can do. And then everyone can be trained and trusted in the importance of structure and contrast and links and images and themes. And I have a list of tools here. And if you have the slide deck, you can click on them. And then I have some accessibility checker tools here. You know, there's the Siteimprove browser extension. And I like to mention this one from the list because it's free and it's really easy to use. It not only does an automated test, but it tells you what to check manually, which is really cool. You know, so if you don't know what you're doing and you want to check accessibility, it will actually go through what you should check. And that is the end of my presentation. I love communicating with people. I love people, especially now because I'm an extrovert in this shelter-in-place world. I am passionate about accessibility, so you can reach out to me anytime. I am Volkswagen Chick because in a previous lifetime, I was a Volkswagen mechanic before I was a hospice nurse. So Volkswagen Chick on Twitter or LinkedIn, and you can find me. And I think I have room for like one question. Does anyone have a question before I have to shut off? And Ian, I see that you would like a link to the slide, so I'll just poke that in there for you. Okay. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'll just sort of call it a day. And I do have another talk coming up in, not right now, but in an hour, and it's called Accessibility as a Moving Target. And some of these, some of the descriptions and the definitions I go over again, but I really talk about not media, but I talk about life cycle of a website and like what's coming up on the horizon and different user agents and things like that. So it's a little bit different talk, but a little bit the same at the same time. So thank you.